Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Can China and the United States coexist peacefully, or are they heading towards a so-called new Cold War? Those are the questions repeatedly asked by many. Last Friday marks the 50th anniversary of Dr. Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China, which paved the way for bilateral relations. But what is even more relevant is how the future will look like for the bilateral relations. On this, earlier I talked to Peter Walker, an expert on China-U.S. relations. He's the author of the book, Powerful, Different, Equal, Overcoming the Misconceptions and Differences Between China and the U.S. Peter has visited China more than 80 times and met a wide range of people from this part of the world. His frequent visits made him realize that there's a split in the narrative about the real China. Here's our talk. And I'm so glad to be joined by Peter Walker. Mr. Walker, what a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. Looking forward to it.
You know, the so-called China threat has been a rallying factor for both political parties to come together, and also has been invented as a way to rally the crowd inside the United States because of the domestic difficulties now. But will that be the right way for the U.S. to rally the crowd for, you know, beyond this year, let's just say, mid and long term? Because some would argue from this part of the world that there will be misperception being formed and advocated by some, using that as a political tool. And then that will lead to the miscalculation. And the miscalculation, once it continues, it will further feed into misconceptions and probably even more. So we're seeing a vicious cycle of that. At least that's what many here in this part of the world think about what is going on in the U.S. and what is the goal of the rhetorical war that's going on right now.
Well, yeah, but let's go back to where the anti-China feeling came from.
Okay.
It was almost entirely driven by Trump. Why was it driven by Trump? Because Trump realized when COVID hit that his, quote, terrific economy was going to start taking a real hit because he did not take COVID seriously.
People are looking at the track record already more than 5 months, and they say, things are not getting better, not as earlier expected before the current person coming into the office, and things are getting, in some areas, even worse.
Yeah, but
and
look,
some policies of Trump administration continues. The latest, China protested 500 Chinese students that are in the major of science and technologies and others going to the United States, their visa being denied. Of course, this is one of those many examples that we're seeing today.
Yeah, but you have to go. First of all, Biden went on record a number of years ago of saying China is not the enemy. And Biden was very steep in foreign affairs, spent time with Xi. He understands China very well. So the reason that Biden has to take the positions he's taking today, which are tougher than anyone expected, is because he's trying to get his domestic agenda focused on infrastructure and improving the social safety net through Congress. And the Republicans can't wait for him to, quote, appear to be soft on China. So he's doing the opposite, but it's only rhetoric. But I think you're going to start to see real progress on trade. You're going to see real progress on a wide range of fronts. You've already seen him take some of the executive orders from Trump, like on TikTok, and reverse them. They're taking a fresh look at the whole issue of, is China a military threat? So I think what you're going to see with Biden is a steady movement towards engagement with China, which you did not have with Trump and you did not have with Pompeo. And you're going to see compromises because...
But comparing to Trump, that's quite a low denominator, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, Trump did not engage China. Let's be clear. I mean, he unilaterally put in place the trade war, which was a lose-lose, which all of the economists said from day one.
You know, Mr. Walker, I want to be polite here, and we understand that, because of the political situation that Trump is being blamed by many things, and rightly so, but one could argue politicians did not originally desire to do that, but with the current political situation, they have to do that. But once the toxic environment is getting ever worse, how will the politicians not follow their, election instinct, but rather follow what many could consider as the right path? And that, to me, will be very interesting from your argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that a lot of the politicians are going to use the China card as a way to argue that, they ought to get elected or reelected. At the end of
Not
the day,
the current administration?
The reality is, if the U.S. can badmouth China all at once, it doesn't affect what happens in China. China has a game plan. It's acting on that game plan. Its economy is moving ahead in a much faster recovery rate than in the U.S. It's not going to be about the military. So increasingly, the U.S. is realizing that the U.S. is suffering from self-inflicted wounds. The fact that we haven't invested in infrastructure and that we haven't invested in basic science has nothing to do with China. It has been the polarization in Washington over the last decade. And so you can argue, which is my strong feeling, is that China should keep doing what it's doing. It works. It has a strong track record. And the U.S. is increasingly recognizing these self-inflicted wounds. So you're now starting to see, there was a big bill passed in Congress of investing over $100 billion in basic science.
I see.
Why? To catch up with China. And so the China bashing is noise that's largely driven by the media in the U.S. and by politicians. And it's just noise. I mean, there's no real consequence to it. The consequence was like the trade war, and that's going to get unraveled because it hurt China and the U.S. even more.
Mr. Walker, history was not, just made overnight, even though there were some of those historical occasions that really changed the world. But if you look at the Cold War, it didn't happen right after the Second World War. It was rather a deteriorating situations geopolitically over 10 to 15 period of time that has led to where the world was then. The Cold War started, escalated. So how do you see, today China and the United States not necessarily on the verge of a Cold War? Where does that come from?
Well, look, I mean, today we are in a Cold War. I would attribute it 90% to the fact that Trump made it a Cold War by blaming China for the loss of blue-collar jobs in the U.S., which frankly had little to do with China, had everything to do with the role of technology in eliminating blue-collar jobs. And then he also blamed China for the flu. But at the end of the day, the facts are pretty clear. Pandemics are, come from unusual sources that are not predictable. The only variable in a pandemic is how you respond. China responded aggressively, and it has had its economy bounce back much faster and with a tiny fraction of the deaths that the U.S. incurred. The U.S. incurred 600,000 deaths so far, and we're still threatened because the people are refusing to get vaccinated. So, at the end of the day, I think it's going to come down to the hard facts, and increasingly the public are going to recognize those facts, and China is going to continue to grow its economy, work on its advanced technologies and BRI, and it's got a totally aligned team against it. And the question is, for the U.S., how is the U.S. going to respond? Biden wants to respond by investing in the future, which I think is the right answer. But he's running up against Republicans who really are basically focused on maintaining the status quo for the relatively well-to-do and wealthy of the U.S. And So you got two diametrically opposed visions of what the U.S. ought to be doing.
Mr. Walker, you have been a business person. You frequent China almost 4 to 6 weeks every time you come to China. You see the changes of this country. But right now, it seems that the businesses at this critical moment when exchanges between the two countries are getting ever more less, shall we put it that way. The business ties are extremely important. Tell me more about how independent businesses should be on both sides so that they would serve as a bridge between the two sides.
Well, look, I think that's really one of the most important opportunities for both the U.S. and China to come together. At the end of the day, the people in Washington know very little about China. They use it for political purposes. If you were to ask the average congressman to answer even basic questions about the history and culture of China or how its model is different, they can't answer them. If you were to ask most people in the media the same questions, they're not factually driven. They don't understand. They're taking points of view that are popular for people who buy their product. So the group in the U.S. that really understands China are the businesses who have been working with China either in a supply chain sense or they're in China in the China market. They understand that China has an agenda, and if you as a private company don't understand China's agenda and the 5-year plan, you're out of sync with what's going on in China and you're not going to be successful. The challenge for the businesses is China has become so politicized by the government and the media that they're cautious about becoming too vocal. Mm-hmm. But I think China and Biden would do a huge service to the relationship if they encourage more back and forth and cooperation among the businesses, because America has a lot to add in value to businesses in China, and China has a lot to add to businesses in the U.S., and they're both huge markets. So business could be a real win-win for both sides. But unfortunately, the voice of business in the U.S. today is not getting heard. Hopefully that will change.
You don't think they're going to be muffled in the longer term?
I think Biden sees the business community as an ally of the U.S. and an important asset of the U.S. And I think he's going to look to help businesses be successful around the world. He understands the trade war was a terrible mistake, and he's going to unravel it. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen on a step-by-step basis.
You know, there has been a lot of respect from this part of the world about the American system, and also about the soft power of the United States. And yet, with the past few years, which that process is still going on right now in the eyes of Chinese, it seems to be rather than a reality, but a myth of the so-called the American dream and American legend and the American value, because people see a lot of real behind the back stabbing by either the politician or the current regulations against China and the Chinese individuals. So, so the whole taste and the whole foundation, one could say, of the relationship, particularly between the two peoples, could be changed. Mr. Walker, maybe it's a little bit of exaggeration in the description, but what's your thought about that?
No, I think you've described it fairly accurately. You know, you have to go back in history. The reality is the U.S. was blessed in its history by a number of factors. The U.S. never had enemies on its border that mattered. I mean, they fought the Mexicans, but at the end of the day, the outcome was pretty much preordained. They've never had to fight on their borders, really. Secondly, they had great natural resources. So in terms of water and energy and climate and arable land, everything was for the benefit of the Americans. And third, they had a huge immigrant influx from Europe of pretty talented people who wanted to work hard and get ahead. And they've been in many ways the backbone of the U.S. economy for quite some time. And then the last thing is, who were the economic competitors of the U.S. over the last 150 years? Europe and Japan. Both of them were decimated by major wars in the 20th century. So I think when you look back on it, I think America tends to say it's the American dream, the American model, and democracy and soft power that made us what we are. And I think there are a lot of other factors, mostly in the U.S.'s favor, that have made us what we are. And now, for the first time, the U.S. is looking at someone who is co-equal in economic strength and momentum. And so I think we're now starting to see the U.S. move away from this historic notion of exceptionalism, that we are preordained to be the global leader indefinitely, to the reality check that our current model is not working for us at the government level, and certainly in relationship to developing countries and soft power. China, because it's doing real things, building infrastructure in these countries, has a much stronger relationship with a lot of the developing countries than the U.S. does. And the U.S. can't just go out and say, we will support you, we're behind you. People are going to say, that's nice, but China's actually building our roads and bridges and tunnels, and that's more important for us right now. So I think the U.S. is at a turning point in terms of recognizing that it's got to get its act together with the government. It's got to give more room to businesses to be effective, and it has to move away from the isolationism that Trump created and engage, especially developing countries, in a constructive way. And those are all the things that China's been doing. And so to me, it's kind of a wake-up call for the U.S. So I think your description is very accurate. I think for the Chinese to be, quote, disillusioned with the American dream is just an accurate read of where we are at this point in time. I also think the U.S. has always been very resilient. It has great resources. It has amazing companies that dominate the global 500. So the U.S. has enormous assets to draw on. But right now, it's dysfunctional, largely because of the government.
They are both having a lot of tasks that they need to accomplish within their own economy, within their own societies. Thank you so much. Peter Walker, what a pleasure.